Hey there. Hi, I'm Mike Watson, co-host of the Acid Left, and I'm here on my own today to discuss Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, and basically where it already goes very wrong. I've only actually read the initial overview or overture discussing Peterson's illness, and the first chapter, Do Not Carelessly Denigrate Social Institutions or Creative Achievement. So this first chapter, basically in line with the book, appears to be aimed at finding a kind of role for the non-rational aspects of life, that is creativity. And this is kind of promising, or at least the idea that Peterson was writing a book as a kind of corrective to his first book, which is about incorporating disorder or chaos into one's life and one's healing process, as he is an analyst. So it appears that kind of very conservative undertaking has continued in this book. So what you have in the beginning of this first chapter is Peterson talking about a man he treated, a client, so to speak, who was very lonely, and he goes from there to pointing to the need for society, or for people in society to connect with each other, and kind of leaps from there bizarrely to early kind of life forms, how kind of simple multicellular organisms basically need to have some kind of hierarchy between their neural cells to kind of order existence. So one has stimuli, and we respond like kind of early and very basic organisms to these stimuli through neural processes, which kind of create hierarchies. So he kind of points to the need for us to organize in our brains such that we can then enjoy a good social life. So there's a bizarre, immediate kind of lobster type approach, where in his first book he talks about humans being like lobsters and how our kind of accumulated knowledge and way of being as genetic beings goes way back to earlier primitive beings, a lobster being, a type of animal that's been in existence for eons. So he doesn't talk about lobsters at this point in the book. Certainly, he talks about very basic creatures, and he talks about hierarchy, therefore, as an evolutionary fact. So he points to the fact that because we have a hierarchy in our brains coming down from very early cellular organisms, which organizes input so as to help us socialize with the outside world, hierarchy must therefore be ingrained. So it's the first kind of very bad take in the book. So what he literally says is negotiation for position sorts organisms into the omnipresent hierarchies that govern access to vital resources such as shelter, nourishment, and mates. Okay, so he immediately equates the hierarchy that happens in the brain of simple organisms with the hierarchy that happens in society as something that is necessary and which we should respect because it comes down from kind of prehistory. And this doesn't really answer, whether we should have hierarchies based on the hierarchies of very basic cellular organisms, or rather the hierarchies that happen in their head, whether these should carry on into society. He just says that we should respect those, and therefore misses like the structural problems of society very early on. He then kind of throws a bone to the people who perhaps aren't top of the hierarchy by talking about the fool, the kind of archetypal fool of Jung, of tarot cards, etc. The fool who is kind of a guy with a head in his clouds, walking around with no cares in life, but nearly walking off a precipice. So he says that, well, this type of person maybe won't go very far, but they are generally not kind of treated as subordinate or not treated as idiots often, because everybody understands that the fool figure is a kind of archetype in stories and they exist in real life that we must kind of pay attention to, because everyone kind of has that fool element of naivety. Everyone starts out like that. The heroes in any kind of book start out like that. The heroes in Harry Potter, the heroes in Greek myth, etc., etc. So he points to the necessity of treating people well, even if they're on a lower level, I guess, because they might develop into more knowledgeable beings who go further up the ladder. So there is kind of a self-serving aspect to this. So basically, he does kind of say, well, the kind of more powerful animal, needs to kind of give way at times, needs to play, talking about rats actually, needs to kind of play with the less powerful animals. That it's not just about winning a game. In order to get to the top in society, you need to be able to play in a number of successive games and build bonds in that way. Therefore, there is a kind of sense in behaving benevolently as a kind of more powerful kind of alpha male or alpha rat, because he's talking about rats mostly in this part. So he's kind of good how he says that, because it means that we should probably demand something of our bosses in terms of good behavior towards subordinates, because it actually is kind of wise in terms of how to succeed in life. So it's even tactically sound, yet he kind of inverts this immediately. So every time he gives something to the weak or to chaotic processes or to rebellion, he takes it away. So it seems like he's trying to co-opt the left and rebellion and, in a sense, working class people who he wouldn't use that word. So he says that, it kind of goes the other way around, that people who are subordinate need to behave well to the powerful. So he's not being critical at all, really. He says, it is very wise to approach your boss carefully and privately with a problem, and perhaps have a solution at hand, and not one preferred to incautiously. So, if you need to argue with your boss, do it privately and do it politely. He doesn't talk about the need to form bonds in the workplace, trade unions, etc., with a view to challenging hierarchies and perhaps unfair practices. He kind of quite quickly moves into the need for weak people, so to speak, to placate powerful people. So he then talks about the resentment that people lower in the chain of command, quoting him here, people lower in the chain of command might feel about their inferior position. It may lead them to work at counter purposes to what they have learned and out of sheer spite. So he kind of characterizes any desire to lash out at hierarchy as being out of sheer spite, again missing capitalism. So this is classic in regard to the first book. He doesn't have any concept of society maybe malfunctioning and us needing to organize against it and being in our right minds when we want to criticize it. So he then goes on to a second client, and this is where it gets really stunning, because he talks about a young woman who's depressed and who he asked to compile some forms relating to her future plans and a present situation. And he said that all was going well until the discussion was twisted towards the political. This is again quoting. So he said, all was going well with my client until the discussion twisted towards the political. After discussing her personal situation, she began to voice her discontent with the state of the world at large, with a looming catastrophe, in her opinion, of the effects of human activity on the environment. Okay, so he has this client. He says, it was going well with her whilst he was talking about why she was so ill, but then she started to discuss how she was worried about the environment. Okay, so this is kind of weird, and it's kind of weird that he's discussing a client in these terms, because that client can probably recognize herself in the book. So this is disregard for professionalism, considering also that Peterson has just been very ill for a prolonged period of time, and he wouldn't want people revealing, maybe secrets about his treatment. I mean, his kind of vision of how he was ill and what went wrong and how he was treated is very much regulated by him and his daughter. So who keeps a YouTube or podcast. So there is, so he carries on there. Now, there is nothing wrong in principle with the expression of concern with planet-wide issues. That is not the point. So he concedes that one is allowed to be annoyed about this, the planet deteriorating at an alarming rate. There's nothing wrong with that, he concedes. That is not the point. Continuing the quote, there is something wrong, however, with overestimating your knowledge of such things, or perhaps even considering when you're a mid-20-year-old with nothing positive going on in your life, and you're having great difficulty even getting out of bed. So there's nothing wrong with overestimating your knowledge of the world and wanting to rebel, of developing ideas that are against the system, eventually, effectively against capitalism, the word he refuses to actually say even in this chapter. You can do that, but you need to get your priorities straight. You can do that, but maybe when you're a mid-20-year-old with nothing positive going on in your life, and you're having difficulty getting out of bed, you need to get your priorities in order. So he's saying that if you're so depressed, you're in bed. So this goes back to the thing he has with beds, and his advice in his first book of making your bed as a kind of good way of dealing with all the problems of your life, and not, instead perhaps taking on capitalism. But he said, if you're having difficulty getting out of bed, you shouldn't be questioning society. He talks about the environment because he doesn't want to probably talk about capitalism, because it kind of raises a whole lot of issues that he doesn't want to get into. So if we contrast this with Mark Fisher, who discusses how capitalism can make you depressed, you see something quite interesting happening, and that is basically a politicization of illness. So Peterson is seeing illness as something which should stop you wanting to look at the world until you've got everything else sorted out. So you need to kind of get away from these kind of ideas of challenging capitalism, which is ruining the environment, and you need to basically deal with yourself first, placate yourself, so that you don't have those kind of ideas. Whereas Fisher says quite clearly that capitalism, in Capitalism Realism, his first book, capitalism causes depression, and towards the end says we need to weaponize depression and mental illness and use it creatively against capitalism. So we see this massive distinction here. But yeah, apparently he didn't like this conversation with this girl who dared discuss what's wrong with the world when she was ill, not considering she might be ill because of what's wrong with the world. And if you're in your early 20s and you think the world's basically ending because of environmental catastrophe, and probably you're aware it's caused partly by industrial capitalism, then you might well get ill. So he actually then goes on to say, excuse the cliche, but it's necessary to walk before you can run. You may even have to crawl before you can walk. This is part of your accepting your position as a beginner. Okay. Then he said, what happened to the millennia of evolution at the bottom of the hierarchy that you so casually, arrogantly, and self-servingly despise? So he's saying, what happened to all that evolution which created this kind of great society of order, which is kind of where he goes in other parts of the chapter. And how dare you challenge that? And it's really contradictory, because if we have millennia of evolution leading to this current point, which is apparently fantastic, despite the terrible mismanagement of coronavirus, which was partly perhaps caused by environmental degradation and capitalism, despite that, we have this society which we shouldn't question, which we dare not question, because it has come about over millennia as a kind of structuring of hierarchies, in the same way that eons old basic animals structured their thoughts in their minds, if they had minds, their brains. So this is kind of a stunning move by Peterson, who tries to appeal to young disaffected people, has appealed to them en masse in the millions with the last book, appeared to be kind of stating that our problems are not ones that can be caused by reconfiguring the system. And in this book actually literally says that we shouldn't be questioning. He does go on at other points to talk about conservatism versus radicalism, and actually discusses radicalism as kind of an evil. If I can find this stunningly bad quote from him. Okay, so he says about ambitious people, the variant of ambition basically that leads to problem solving on the part of ambitious people who become powerful. The variant of ambition needs to be encouraged in every possible manner. Okay. It is for this reason, among many others, that the increasingly reflexive identification of the striving of boys and men towards victory with patriarchal tyranny that hypothetically characterizes our modern productive and free societies is so suddenly counterproductive, and it must be said, cruel. So he's saying it is this identification of male competitiveness and patriarchal tyranny, such that competitiveness of men is equated with tyranny, and somehow creates a bad society. That this is suddenly counterproductive. That it is, he says, cruel. There's nothing worse, he continues, than treating someone striving for competence as a tyrant in training. So this is kind of bad. He's basically saying that the kind of equation of toxic masculinity with everything that's wrong with society is cruel, is evil in a sense, because it kind of undoes the whole of evolution leading towards this point of superiority and the fact of competition existing to kind of spur us on. So it's kind of social Darwinism in a sense. So I just want to go to another quote which came in just after that. It says, he says, to adopt an attitude of naive or willfully blind cynicism about this, or to deny outright that it is true, is to position yourself, perhaps purposefully, as people have many dark motives, as an enemy of the practical amelioration of suffering itself. So to adopt an attitude of naive or willfully blind cynicism to the value of competition is to position yourself, perhaps on purpose, against the resolution, the kind of solution or cure of suffering itself. He says, I can think of few more sadistic attitudes. So basically we have a situation here where he says that to question the value of masculinity in an aggressive sense is basically to side against the resolution of inequality and injustice in the world. So just terrible on all fronts. He does then go on to talk about his first client that he discussed there, the man who was basically ill because he had no friends, going on to become an artist. That he as it was a way of curing himself, he took to photography and then scribbles, or abstract drawing, that Peterson first describes as scribbles, and says that this is good because creativity is good if it's tempered by conservatism. Dismisses the guy's angry scribbles at first, but then says they start to kind of be okay when one sees a form emerging in them, when the scribbles start to kind of take on geometric characteristics. So basically makes the mistake he made in his first book. We're talking about Beethoven and saying that, Beethoven's symphony, he discusses there with relation to Adorno, who he misrepresents terribly, which I discuss in my book, Can the Left Learn to Meme? What he basically does in that book is suggest that Beethoven's symphony, is good because it brings together many kind of disparate forms and makes them kind of orderly. So he's doing the same thing here. He's saying creativity is good, and he says this throughout the chapter, if it's tempered by conservatism. So this guy's abstract scribbles lead to something and lead to a kind of a wellness. The guy becomes better as his abstract scribbles become more geometric and less abstract. Like Beethoven's symphony is good because it kind of tempers a kind of chaotic element. Actually, Beethoven's symphony he was discussing, I think it's number 9, which Adorno also discusses, is good in a sense because it's chaotic. It's nearly falling apart in places. I mean, it's very bombastic. It has these kind of strong elements of dissonance. What Adorno would say would provoke a shudder in the subject, which would kind of take them out of their fake orderly reality and towards chaos and a kind of oneness with nature rather than a control of it. So Peterson is kind of again trying to portray creativity as good if it's conservative. So, I mean, he fails to address kind of things that were laughable in instances in his first book, and he actually kind of goes to greater extremes, calling a critique of power cruel, suggesting you approach your boss with humility, not accepting that capitalism may be the problem, or our current societal organization may be responsible for suffering caused by hierarchy, and so on. So I'd say the jury's out because the book's not finished, but I would say actually going on how the first chapter of his last book related to the rest of the book, the first chapter of this book signals without a doubt that this is really a strongly right-wing book aimed at suggesting that young people heal themselves where they're unwell, not by addressing societal problems, but by ignoring those problems and actually put them to one side, at all costs, avoiding conflict with the system and actually co-opting creativity and chaos to the conservative system, rather than using it to improve the system in some senses, or where the system is over hierarchical. So that's my first thoughts. I hope they're useful to you, and see you again soon on The Acid Left.